Choosing which car you want to buy for the sake of renting that car out on platforms like Turo can be a really tough task. Which car is the best one? Which one's the most reliable? Which one will make you the most money? There are simply so many different answers to these questions. And so one helpful way to approach this is to, instead of focusing on which cars you should buy, instead focus on the ones you shouldn't buy and which ones should be avoided entirely. And so that's exactly what we're going to be talking about in this video, and I'm going to be breaking down some of the cars that you should avoid buying for the sake of renting them out on Turo. These are cars that are either simply unreliable, too expensive, oversaturated, or there may be some other factors at play. The first one on this list is one that if you're a longtime viewer of this channel, this will not surprise you one bit, and that is Teslas. Now, I get it. Teslas are cool cars, and the idea of getting a Tesla and using a platform like Turo or car sharing to justify and afford that Tesla is something that has really gained traction over the years. But no matter which way you slice it, Teslas are just too oversaturated on Turo. There's just too many of them. There are simply too many Model 3s and Model Ys, and while there aren't as many Model X's or Model S's on the platforms, these cars have gone up so much in price over the years that they are simply too expensive to make any decent ROI for renting them out. Now, I'm not ragging on all electric vehicles. In fact, I like electric cars. I'm a firm EV believer myself, and I think that if you are somebody who wants to rent out electric cars, it could be a great way to make some extra cash depending on which EV you buy and at what price point you buy it at. But whenever it comes to Teslas, I just think there are so many other better options out there that can make you a better ROI, that are more unique, and that will have more longevity on the Turo platform compared to Tesla. In my opinion, I think that you shouldn't touch Teslas and Turo with a 10-foot pole. Next up is everyday cars that have a dual clutch transmission. Now, a dual clutch automatic transmission is a type of transmission that is featured in some everyday cars, but it's also pretty common in sports cars as well. And a dual clutch automatic transmission can have a heavy effect on how a vehicle feels whenever you're driving it. It almost gives a borderline manual feel to an automatic car. And though this is very common in sports cars, it's also featured in other normal everyday cars like a Ford Fiesta, for example. Now, the Ford Fiesta does have transmission problems, which is a whole other issue, and one of the many reasons why, in most cases, I would avoid buying a Ford Fiesta. But these transmission issues are pretty widely documented, and if you do research on Ford Fiestas, you'll see a ton about them, so I don't want to cover that in this video. Instead, I want to focus on the dual clutch automatic transmission because this is a factor of Ford Fiestas that people don't really talk about in the context of Turo. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that whenever you have an automatic dual clutch transmission, it almost gives the vibe that the car is driving like a manual. Now, I know if you actually compare a dual clutch to a manual transmission, they really aren't anything alike, but that really is like one of the best ways that I can explain it. And whenever you're driving a normal everyday car with this type of transmission, it almost feels like the car is stalling or it's struggling to shift gears. But that's actually just how the car drives. And for some people who aren't expecting this or who have never been in a car with this type of transmission, it can be a bit jarring. Now, HP and I have a 2014 Fiesta in our Turo fleet, and the reason why we bought this Ford Fiesta is because we got it for a killer deal, and we got it right after the car had its transmission replaced. So we bought it with a brand new transmission, and though this car has been performing extremely well on Turo, we do occasionally get complaints from guests who ask us if the transmission is okay, if it's safe to drive, who complain that the car is a manual whenever they requested an automatic, people who say that the transmission is going out. We've had a number of complaints over the last year, and it really all revolves around the fact that this car is a dual clutch automatic transmission and guests just simply aren't used to it. Now, the reason why I specify normal everyday cars with this type of transmission is because this type of transmission and how it's received really does depend on which car you're driving it with. For example, HP's GT500 also has a dual clutch automatic transmission. And because you get into a GT500 not expecting the smoothest drive, the dual clutch isn't really noticeable because it's just part of the car. In a normal everyday car like the Ford Fiesta, it feels as though it's almost occasionally stalling. But in the GT500, it gives it a really sporty, aggressive feel. I think that the dual clutch automatic transmission vehicle, if purchased at the right price, could be a decent route to go down. But if you're somebody who's brand new to Turo and you're looking for your first or your second car and you don't have a lot of trips under your belt, I would personally recommend to steer clear of any types of car with this transmission. It simply can be a hit or a miss, and whenever you're first starting out, you can't afford those 2 or 3 star reviews. Because of that, I would avoid or at least be extremely leery of cars with this type of transmission, and remember that dual clutch clutch aside, Fiestas have a really bad transmission problem, so even if you are comfortable with the dual clutch aspect of these vehicles, I probably would steer clear of Fiestas as a whole. While we're on the topic of transmissions, the next car that you should avoid is anything with a CVT transmission, namely Nissan. Being as though I am married to HP and he is the biggest car guy ever, I have asked him the question, if there is one car that I wanted to buy for myself for my personal daily driver that you could veto and not allow for me to buy it, which car would that be? And whenever I ask this question, the answer is always the same, and it's always said without hesitation, and that is Nissan. Nissans are affordable cars on the surface, and over the years, their design has gotten better and better. In fact, over the last couple of years, I feel like the Nissan Altima is one of the sharpest cars on the road for the price point, but their transmission is absolutely horrendous. Transmissions break on these cars insanely early, and they are very, very expensive to fix. Take the abuse of a Turo renter into the equation and you have a costly repair that will hinder you from ever making any decent profit on Turo. Nissans are just simply not worth it. There's not a single model or a year that I would recommend. They are all bad. They all have poor reputations. They're all expensive to fix. They simply should be avoided at all costs. I would even go as far as to say if you're somebody that currently has a Nissan, I would encourage you to sell it and get something else. If there is one thing that you ever take away from this channel, it is to not buy a Nissan and not rent out that Nissan on Turo. The next one on this list is going to be a controversial one, and it's one that I've talked about on my channel before, and as time goes on and as the car market shifts, it's one that I continue to stand by more and more. And that is to avoid buying new model cars. Now, you guys know that I'm a proponent of buying low-end economy cars, so I buy cars that are 8 to 10 years old, $4,000 to $6,000 in price, and that's what I have found works best for me. Now, I understand that some people prefer new cars, and though I don't think that that's the best business model to use, I absolutely can agree that there can be a time and place depending on how you approach it. But what I'm specifically talking about are cars that are brand new, so 2023 year model. I also want to emphasize new models that are newly introduced. So for example, Rivians, Lucid, Ford Bronco, these cars that didn't exist previously and have been introduced brand new in the last couple of years. And I also want to emphasize new generation vehicles as well. For example, the new generation Toyota Prius. Now, I've talked about this a lot on my channel from a few different perspectives. I think from an ROI perspective, new cars just simply do not make sense. But that's not the lens that I want to focus on in this video. Instead, I want to focus on the reliability aspect of these cars, specifically recalls. Recalls are significantly more common on new cars than used cars. And this becomes an issue because of the fact that you cannot rent out a car on Turo if it has an open recall. And when it comes to recalls, newer model cars, newly introduced models, and new generations of vehicles have more recalls, and their recalls are much less predictable than older cars. And because of this, I would simply stay away from these cars altogether. A perfect example of this, and I think to a degree a cautionary tale of what can happen in a worst case scenario with recalls, is the Ford Bronco. Just a couple of weeks ago, Ford announced a recall on select model Ford Broncos due to a fire risk. And 500,000 of these cars were recalled. And the problem is there isn't a remedy for this recall until next year. So everybody who purchased this type of Ford Bronco to list it out on Turo, and there were a ton of them, now are not able to rent that car out, they're not making money, and they're stuck with this car that costs them quite a lot of money. And I've seen people over the last couple of weeks simply sell their Ford Broncos and get something else that they can rent out. And sure, that strategy works right now whenever the car market is still inflated, but that strategy won't work forever. And what happens if you buy a car, it has a recall without a remedy, and you're not able to sell that car because you're underwater? This is a very real scenario that absolutely could happen. And I think that you need to make sure that you're protecting yourself in case of this worst case scenario. The fact is, recalls with no remedies are more common on newer model cars. And if you're somebody who's buying a new car because you're wanting to enjoy it yourself and you're just renting it out on Turo in order to make some extra cash and you don't really care if it gets unlisted from Turo, then this isn't really an issue for you at all, and this advice is pretty much irrelevant. But if you're somebody that's buying these newer, hotter cars exclusively to rent them out on Turo and you rely on Turo in order to make that monthly payment, then in my opinion, I think it is just simply too risky, and there's too many aspects that you don't have control over. And I think that once the car market continues to fall, which I wholeheartedly think that it will, it's going to put these Turo hosts that have these vehicles in an even worse position. Now again, I'm not saying that you have to go with a car that's 10 years old, but going with a car that's a little bit older than a new model year vehicle could be a great way to add some safeguards in case there are recalls that do take place. Because the likelihood of these cars not having a recall remedy for an extended period of time are much smaller. And last, but certainly not least, a type of car that you should avoid is one where the numbers just simply don't make sense. Now remember, whenever it comes to Turo, you can make money through a few different sources: the daily trip fee, cleaning fees, various other fees like overage miles, as well as damage claims. But whenever it comes down to determining which cars are the best investments and which cars will provide you with the best ROI, the best indicator to determine this is by using the daily trip price and the daily trip price alone, because this is the only guaranteed figure that you can count on. One of the reasons why I'm such a proponent of buying low-end economy cars is because the numbers just make sense. I could buy a $5,000 Ford Focus and I can list that car on Turo for $32 per day and have that car rented out over 90% of the time. While a car like a Tesla rents in my market for between $70 and $80 per day. Sure, the Tesla is going to make 2 times as much per day than my Ford Focus, but the Tesla costs 10 times as much. Or another great example is something like a Jeep Wrangler. You can rent a Jeep Wrangler on Turo for $60 per day. And sure, that's going to make more than my Ford Focus, but it also costs 8 times as much. And I know that there are a number of counter arguments that people love to make about the low-end economy car potential ROI. And these arguments include things like time commitment, parts, repairs, maintenance, and things like that. And once you take these things into account, you're actually not making as much money as it seems. And though this can be true depending on which types of low-end economy cars you have, it actually isn't as true as you would think it would be. And I've disputed these different points in a number of different videos, so I won't go into detail here. The point is, it's pretty easy to determine which cars are and are not worth buying for Turo, and it really does come down to some basic math. Whenever you're looking at your market and you're figuring out which cars are being listed and which cars are being rented, do math and figure out which cars have the best potential ROI, and make your decision based off of that number. If a car simply doesn't make sense from a financial standpoint, then I would probably recommend avoiding it. And of course, there are some exceptions to this rule. For example, if you're wanting to buy a car and just list it out on Turo for fun, but if your goal is to make money and to have the highest ROI as possible, make sure that you're doing the math for every car you're wanting to buy. The point is that as long as you buy a reliable car, your market is going to dictate which car is the best car to buy. And different markets are going to demand different types of cars. So it's very hard for me to sit here and tell you exactly which cars to search for because there's simply too many factors that have to be taken into account. But there is one thing for certain, and that is that the cars that I've discussed in this video are cars that absolutely should be avoided. And as long as you do that, then you'll be getting off on the right start. Whether you're somebody that's wanting to start a Turo fleet or scale a Turo fleet upwards. But like always, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it. So make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell. And I will see you guys in the next video.